Neoliberalism is a term whose usage and definition have changed over time. Since the 1980s, the term has been used by scholars in a wide variety of social sciences and critics primarily in reference to the resurgence of 19th-century ideas associated with laissez-faire economic liberalism. Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, its advocates supported extensive economic liberalization policies such as privatization, fiscal austerity, deregulation, free trade, and reductions in government spending in order to enhance the role of the private sector in the economy. Neoliberalism is famously associated with the economic policies introduced by Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States. The transition of consensus towards neoliberal policies and the acceptance of neoliberal economic theories in the 1970s are seen by some academics as the root of financialization, with the financial crisis of 2007-8 one of the ultimate results. Neoliberalism was originally an economic philosophy that emerged among European liberal scholars in the 1930s in an attempt to trace a so-called third, or middle way, between the conflicting philosophies of classical liberalism and socialist economic planning. The impetus for this development arose from a desire to avoid repeating the economic failures of the early 1930s, which were mostly blamed on the economic policy of classical liberalism. In the decades that followed, the use of the term neoliberal tended to refer to theories at variance with the more laissez-faire doctrine of classical liberalism, and promoted instead a market economy under the guidance and rules of a strong state, a model which came to be known as the social market economy. In the 1960s, usage of the term neoliberal heavily declined. When the term was reintroduced in the 1980s in connection with Augusto Pinochet's economic reforms in Chile, the usage of the term had shifted. It had not only become a term with negative connotations employed principally by critics of market reform, but it also had shifted in meaning from a moderate form of liberalism to a more radical and laissez-faire capitalist set of ideas. Scholars now tended to associate it with the theories of economists Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. Once the new meaning of neoliberalism was established as a common usage among Spanish-speaking scholars, it diffused directly into the English-language study of political economy. Scholarship on the phenomenon of neoliberalism has been growing. The impact of the global 2008-9 crisis has also given rise to new scholarship that critiques neoliberalism and seeks developmental alternatives. Terminology. The German scholar Alexander Rustow coined the term neoliberalism in 1938 at the colloquium Walter Lippmann. The colloquium defined the concept of neoliberalism as involving the priority of the price mechanism, free enterprise, the system of competition, and a strong and impartial state. To be neoliberal meant advocating a modern economic policy with state intervention. Neoliberal state interventionism brought a clash with the opposite laissez-faire camp of classical liberals, like Ludwig von Mises. While present-day scholars tend to identify Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Ayn Rand as the most important theorists of neoliberalism, most scholars in the 1950s and 1960s understood neoliberalism as referring to the social market economy and its principal economic theorists such as Eucken, Ropke, Rustow, and Müller-Armack. Although Hayek had intellectual ties to the German neoliberals, his name was only occasionally mentioned in conjunction with neoliberalism during this period due to his more pro-free market stance. Friedman's name essentially never appeared in connection with neoliberalism until the 1980s. In the 60s, use of the term neoliberal heavily declined. Another movement from the American left that used the term neoliberalism to describe its ideology formed in the United States in the 1970s. Prominent neoliberal politicians supposedly included Al Gore and Bill Clinton of the Democratic Party of the United States. The neoliberals coalesced around two magazines, The New Republic and The Washington Monthly. The godfather of this version of neoliberalism was the journalist Charles Peters, who in 1983 published a Neoliberals Manifesto. Elizabeth Tandy Shermer argues that academics started using neoliberalism in the 1970s to describe and decry a late 20th century effort by policymakers, think tank experts, and industrialists to condemn social democratic reforms and unapologetically implement free market policies. Other academics note that neoliberalism has critics from across the political spectrum. During the military rule under Augusto Pinochet in Chile, opposition scholars took up the expression to describe the economic reforms implemented in Chile after 1973 and its proponents. Once the new meaning of neoliberalism was established as a common usage among Spanish-speaking scholars, it diffused directly into the English-language study of political economy. In the last 2 decades, according to the Bowers and Garnsmore study of 148 journal articles, it has largely become a term of condemnation employed by critics, and it now suggests a market fundamentalism closer to the laissez-faire principles of the paleoliberals than to the ideas of the original neoliberals who attended the colloquium. This leaves some controversy as to the precise meaning of the term and its usefulness as a descriptor in the social sciences, especially as the number of different kinds of market economies have proliferated in recent years. In the book Neoliberalism, a very short introduction, published by Oxford University Press, the authors argue that neoliberalism is anchored in the principles of the free market economics. According to Bowers and Garnsmore, neoliberalism is nowadays an academic catchphrase used mainly by critics as a pejorative term. Daniel Stedman Jones, a historian of the concept, says the term is too often used as a catch-all shorthand for the horrors associated with globalization and recurring financial crises. Nowadays, the most common use of the term neoliberalism refers to market-oriented reform policies such as eliminating price controls. The term is used in several senses. As a development model, it refers to the rejection of structuralist economics in favor of the Washington Consensus. As an ideology, the term is used to denote a conception of freedom as an overarching social value associated with reducing state functions to those of a minimal state. And finally, as an academic paradigm, the term is closely related to neoclassical economic theory. The sociologists Fred L. Block and Margaret R. Summers claim there is a dispute over what to call the influence of free market ideas which have been used to justify the retrenchment of New Deal programs and policies over the last 30 years. Neoliberalism, laissez-faire or just free market ideology. Other academics, such as Susan Bridley and Meg Luxton, assert that neoliberalism is a political philosophy which seeks to liberate the processes of capital accumulation. American professor of political science and democratic socialist Francis Fox Piven sees neoliberalism as essentially hypercapitalism. Robert W. McChesney, American professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and co-editor of the independent socialist magazine Monthly Review, claims that the term neoliberalism, which he defines as capitalism with the gloves off, is largely unknown by the general public, particularly in the United States. Early history. Colloquium. Walter Lippmann. In the 1930s, the mood was decidedly anti-liberal. The worldwide Great Depression brought about high unemployment and widespread poverty. The crisis was widely regarded as the failure of economic liberalism. Among them were Louis Rugier, Walter Lippmann, Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Wilhelm Röpke and Alexander Rustow. Following the core message of Lippmann's book The Good Society, participants like Rustow, Lippmann and Rugier agreed that the old liberalism of laissez-faire had failed and that a new liberalism needed to take its place. while for them it was a farewell to classical liberalism, which they thought to have failed. Other participants like Mises and Hayek were not convinced to condemn the old liberalism of laissez-faire, but all participants were united in their call for a new liberal project. Following Rostow's original recommendation, they called this project neoliberalism. The neoliberalism that came out of the Walter Lippmann colloquium was generally in line with Rostow's theories of turning away from conceptions of laissez-faire towards a market economy under the guidance and the rules of a strong state. It was an attempt to formulate an anti-capitalist, anti-communist third way. Neoliberalism was originally established as something quite different from the free market radicalism with which it is usually associated today. But at the Walter Lippmann colloquium, the fundamental differences between true neoliberals around Rostow and Lippmann on the one hand and old-school liberals around Mises and Hayek on the other were already quite visible. While true neoliberals demanded state intervention to correct undesirable market structures, Mises had always insisted that the only legitimate role for the state was to abolish barriers to market entry. Similar differences of opinion also existed in other questions such as social policy and the scope for interventionism. After a few years, the insurmountable differences between old liberals and the neoliberals became unbearable. Rostow was bitter that Mises still adhered to a version of liberalism that Rostow thought had failed spectacularly. In a letter, Rostow wrote that Hayek and his master Mises deserved to be put in spirits and placed in a museum as one of the last surviving specimen of an otherwise extinct species of liberals which caused the current catastrophe. Mises became equally critical of the German neoliberals. He complained that ordoliberalism really meant ordo-interventionism. Michel Foucault uses the term in this sense in his famous 1978-79 lectures on biopolitics. He discusses the late 30s German meaning used by Walter Lippmann and others, of a middle way between capitalism and socialism. He says, neoliberalism is not Adam Smith, neoliberalism is not market society, and to him it clearly does not mean Hayek and Milton Friedman. Mont Pelerin Society. The Mont Pelerin Society was founded in 1947 by Friedrich Hayek to bring together the widely scattered free market thinkers and political figures. Hayek and others believed that classical liberalism had failed because of crippling conceptual flaws and that the only way to diagnose and rectify them was to withdraw into an intensive discussion group of similarly minded intellectuals, with central planning in the ascendancy worldwide and few avenues to influence policymakers. The society served to bring together isolated advocates of liberalism as a rallying point, as Milton Friedman phrased it. Meeting annually, it would soon be a kind of international who's who of the classical liberal and neoliberal intellectuals, while the first conference in 1947 was almost half American. The Europeans' concentration dominated by 1951. Europe would remain the epicenter of the community, with Europeans dominating the leadership.